Welcome, everybody. I'm glad to see everybody here. I think this is going to be a really fantastic event. I wanted to just start off with some of the housekeeping side of things first. If you have a question, please enter it into the Q&A. I will be managing the Q&A once we get to that section of the presentation. Our speaker will speak first, then we'll do at least 20 minutes of Q&A to the end. So we'd love to have your questions. With so many people, we can't unmute people. So it's really you type in the Q&A and we'll go from there. You may also use the chat box if you need to communicate with us. And those are probably the two best ways to get in touch with me as we're going through this and as Mary is speaking. So let me go ahead and introduce Mary. We have a great guest. It's Mary Tuttle. I've said her name 3 times now. Going to talk with us about trauma and parenting. Mary is a RIE Associate, mother of 2, and owner of a home-based infant and toddler center. She has a BA in early childhood education from Ashford University and has a long history of working with abuse and neglect prevention. I think that her experience and the way she's pulling things together here will be really good for all of us. With that, Mary, I'm going to turn it over to you if you want to say anything before you share your screen.
No, I'm glad you pretty much covered who I am. I'm glad you're all here, and we'll get started. Please write down any questions you have. I know this can be a very personal and emotional topic. I'm happy to talk about anything that you feel like sharing, and as you're typing in questions, you'll be anonymous, so feel free to really dig in and ask what you want to know. All right. Okay. Now I just need to go to share plate. All right, are you seeing the right thing now?
We're not seeing your screen yet.
Oh, we had all this ready, guys, and now it's giving me a hard time. Okay, let's see here. Let me go back to Zoom. Share screen, here we go. And play. All right, so I'm right at the end of it where we last were. Started at the beginning here. Okay, there we go. So what's trauma got to do with it? As Michelle said, I'm Mary Tuttle, and I'm working in the field for over 20 years with families as a RIE Associate. I worked for several years at a place called Healthy Families, which is an abuse and neglect prevention program. And that's when I really started to get interested in how trauma, our own personal trauma, affects our parenting, and how we can manage and mitigate that so that we are able to be more present for our children. So to start with, I think it's important for us to have sort of a general definition of trauma so that we're kind of all on the same page. So there can be one event that's a trauma, a deeply distressing or disturbing event, whether that's a death, an accident, a physical injury. And then you can also speak about trauma as the shock following the stressful event. So, and that can be associated either with physical shock and sometimes leads to long-term neurosis. So what does that look like? You'll hear people talk about toxic stress. So stress is part of our everyday lives. It's something that we all have, and some stress is good. You know, if life was just easy all the time, it would be 1, boring, and 2, there would be very little growth. You know, in RIE, we talk about allowing children to struggle a little bit. You know, if a toy is out of reach, let them reach for it so they don't get have learned helplessness, where they learn that they can't help themselves and they need to rely on an adult. So that will have, you know, brief increases in heart rate, mild elevations in stress hormone levels, but it goes back down. Tolerable is where you have a more serious temporary stress response, but if you're in a supportive relationship, that response can be buffered. So we know that a healthy attachment is very important to buffering that stress. And since we are talking about parenting, that's generally going to be a parent-child relationship. So if you and your child have a trusting, solid relationship, you're going to be able to help them regulate their stress levels. So toxic stress is a prolonged activation of your stress response system in the absence of protective relationships. So if you have an insecure attachment as an adult or as a child, if your environment keeps things from being stable, we're going to talk about ACEs here in a minute, that stress activation is going to get you stuck in a more stress response state. So ACEs are adverse childhood experiences, and there's 3 types, which are listed here. There is a questionnaire where you can get your ACE score. And what they have learned and studied now is that the higher your ACE score, the more likely you are to develop certain problems later. There's physical things that can happen, mental illness that can happen. So the more of these that you have, the more likely it is that you're going to experience some detrimental effects later. It's not a guarantee. Obviously, folks have different levels of resilience. Some kids, really suffer and cannot move past. Others are able to bounce back a little more readily simply because that's how they're built. So when we talk about toxic stress and trauma, the nervous system is talked about a lot. So obviously the central nervous system is your brain and your spinal cord, the main components of your nervous system. So the brain is your processor, it receives and processes information. Your peripheral nervous system breaks down into motor neurons and sensory neurons, and eventually down into your sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. Now, your sympathetic system is what gets activated very heavily in your fight or flight or freeze. We now know freeze is part of that. It's not just fight or flight systems. So here's what can happen. And the reason I talk about this is because it's important to be able to realize when you're having a stress response, especially if you do have some past trauma that can get reactivated. We're going to talk a little bit about that more. But when your sympathetic nervous system is activated, your pupils are going to dilate, your heart rate's going to increase, your breath is going to get faster, your digestion's not going to be good, it's going to stimulate epinephrine and norepinephrine and cortisol. And as a result, you're going to have that feeling that you either want to throw a punch, you want to run away, or you freeze like a bunny rabbit or deer in headlights. Now, one of the things that stress does is release cortisol, and heightened levels of cortisol have been connected to all kinds of things. High blood pressure, heart disease, decrease in pain, digestive issues and weight gain, sleep disturbances. So it's important that we try as much as possible to keep our regulatory system balanced. So what happens when trauma gets stuck? So that's what happens when you have almost like PTSD in a sense, not necessarily to the extent of like a war veteran, but it can be. So what happens is the brain doesn't reset. The trauma doesn't get processed and the brain stays in that reactive state where it's involuntary. It is looking for danger at any time and just expecting it to come. So GABA is the calming hormone, and it is lowered when your adrenaline is released. So your body's ability to calm itself is lowered as well. If you get reminded of an event, it can cause emotional or physical upset. And that's important because, sorry, it's hot in my office. That's important because as parents, we cannot control how our children are going to behave. So sometimes one of their behaviors can remind us of a past trauma and can cause that emotional or physical upset. For example, if you were physically hit as a child and that has not been processed appropriately, your kid smacks you across the face and you have a very reactive response that has nothing to do with your child's behavior and everything to do with your sympathetic nervous system getting triggered. Your body gets extra fatigued, especially your adrenal glands, because you're on high alert all the time. There's also a hormone called glucocorticoid, and I find this fascinating because it actually kills the cells in the hippocampus, which is the part of the brain that integrates memories into storage, basically, to simplify it. So what can happen is that it keeps the hippocampus in the mode of just taking in the information in an interactive mode, so that your memories aren't integrated and turned into like a past tense. So it feels like something that's still happening. It doesn't get processed in a way that you store it as something that happened in the past. So a post-traumatic brain is intrusive, comes up when you don't want it to. Dissociation can be another tool that is used of the brain to protect itself from trauma. So if you get reminded of the past trauma, you can sort of step outside of your body almost and dissociate, which obviously when parenting can be problematic because it breaks that relationship. Numbing is the same kind of situation. And your brain can be highly aroused, so you're very sensitive to stimuli. So it can look very different in adults and children. So signs that your child is going to be outside the window of tolerance for stress. Now, that's not to say they're necessarily in trauma mode yet, but it just means they're getting to a point where they cannot cope with the level of stress that they have. I'm hearing a lot about this during our COVID-19 and isolation because it's stressful for kids and for us. Everybody's in sort of a high level of stress. So things that you might see are regressions to stages of behavior they've previously outgrown. You might see bedwetting or baby talk or wanting a pacifier or asking for a bottle when they haven't had it for months. Reactions that seem inappropriate for a given situation. So something that may have been irritating before to them ends up feeling like the end of the world. Like you ask them to brush their teeth and it's total meltdown. Whereas before they would have just said, oh, okay, Mom, yeah, I'll go brush my teeth. Behaviors that are different in any way than ways they typically behave. So normally they're happy, snuggly kids and they don't want you to touch them. Or they can usually help clean up the kitchen or do the dishes or clean their rooms without much fuss if you just ask. And now it's a huge battle. So we need to be sensitive to those things, that they are they're a way to express an unmet need. So how can we help? It's going to be really important to tune in so that you can assess what your child needs and help turn the stressful situations into opportunities for growth. So stress is not all bad. There are ways to learn from what has happened and learn new coping strategies and grow as a person. You want to look for what the behavior is trying to communicate, and you need to remember that children's brains are wired for survival. Everything they do and their behaviors are to get a need met, to be able to survive, to grow and evolve as people. So you want to avoid making an assumption about how your child will or is reacting and listen to what they're telling you. So you might assume that your child hates being away from their friends when really they're enjoying the time at home with you. And it's going to be important to do stress busters for the entire family. So whether that's doing some meditation together or getting outside and exercising or just doing some deep breathing and play whenever possible. So I wanted to I just wanted to give you sort of an overview of what happens to the brain when there's trauma being experienced. And then I kind of wanted to tie it back into RIE and the ways in which RIE is already doing many of the things that are recommended to treat trauma. So if you just want to take a quick look at this, I'm assuming many of you probably know these things, but respect, an authentic child who feels secure, autonomous, competent, and connected, so that someone is deeply interested in me. That's what we talked about in terms of buffering that stress with a strong connected relationship. Trust in their competence. So watching a child and trusting them to tell you in some way what they're feeling and believing them when they tell you that. Sensitive observation, so that tuning in that we talked about. Caregiving times involving the child. So one of the things that I am most grateful to RIE for is the idea that if I can give a child 100% of my attention during the caregiving times, then there can be other times to explore the environment with minimal adult intervention. And what this does is allow the adult to care for themselves as well. So when they are with their child, they can be truly present. I had postpartum depressions, and this allowed me to know that my child was getting what they needed, regardless of my inability to be present all the time. I could rally and give her 100% attention during those caregiving times, and then I could leave her to play and check out in certain times to take care of myself and be able to give all that I could at the time. And the safe, challenging, predictable environment is important that way too, because you have to have that safe space to be able to have time for yourself to recharge when needed. And then consistency, routine is great during stress and trauma times, because a child will know what to expect and what's coming next when so many other things are unpredictable. And having that safe, solid base is going to make it a lot easier to deal with the unexpected things that come up. So this is sort of from a guideline for trauma-based care. And a lot of these things already are sort of folded into RIE. We talk about reciprocity all the time. So give what you also need to receive: listening, empathy, and empowerment. So if we model for our children how to listen, how to be empathetic, and how to feel empowered, they're going to pick that up. Choice. So it can be a big trigger for somebody who is a survivor of trauma to be denied choice and control. So if you confer, collaborate, and cooperate, that can really help. And of course, this needs to be at a developmentally appropriate level. For a young toddler, it might be, would you like to wear the red shirt or the blue shirt today? Would you, because they can't go to the park or they can't go do these other things. So having control wherever possible is very empowering for them. Perspective. So be aware when the past is intruding into the present, and don't take responsibility for what's not yours, gently. So with kids, that's going to be kind of internal. They don't need to bear the burden of that necessarily, but you can say to yourself when your 7-year-old has just thrown a tantrum over something they didn't before, or your toddler, or you can remind yourself, okay, this is not a personal attack. Here's what I think is going on, and be able to move forward through that. And you may even narrate that to them and say, wow, I can see you are really upset. I'm wondering if there's something, for a 7-year-old, you could say, I'm wondering if there's something else going on. What's happening right now? Is this really about brushing teeth? If it is, okay, but if not, I'm here if and when you're ready to talk. And that conversation may need to happen later, once the child is back into their thinking brain and out of that emotional limbic system. Recalibration. So rid overreacting, oversensitive, or over anything from your vocabulary. When a person is stressed and traumatized, there is no overreacting. They need to be allowed to process those feelings and feel what they feel when they feel it. Predictability, we talk about those routines, and consistency that Magda talks about in the principles. Every trauma survivors prefer predictability because that feels safer. So it's good for all of us to have some predictability in our lives. And then space, allow time to calm down and take perspective. So trauma survivors often have difficulty regulating. So as an adult, if you're a trauma survivor, you may struggle with regulating yourself, especially when your toddler or young child is dysregulated. It can get really intense. And sometimes it might take you longer to calm down. And trauma doesn't have to be some big, huge traumatic event. I'm going to share a personal story. When my daughter was, gosh, how old was she? 2.5. I had so much rage, this dissociative kind of rage, that I was like, why am I having this huge reaction? Intellectually, I knew what was going on and how her behavior was typical and normal, but I was having this reaction. Now, when my parents got divorced, my mom was a great mom, but when my parents got divorced, she sunk into a depression and she was emotionally gone. I didn't feel heard. I didn't feel listened to. I know all this now after a bunch of therapy to figure out why I was so angry at my 2.5-year-old who wasn't listening to me, because it wasn't about her not listening. It was about the fact that I hadn't felt listened to as a kid, and there was no space for my feelings because I was worried about everybody else during this divorce time. So things like that can get triggered by emotional interactions with our kids as well. So what are triggers? You heard me just say trigger, and there's a difference between being triggered and being uncomfortable. So if you have a history of trauma, and being around anything that reminds you of the traumatic event can make you feel like you're experiencing the trauma all over again. So if you are triggered, you may feel those physical symptoms, or you may have an emotional response before you even know why you're upset. So what can you do about it? Okay, so here's what we can do as an adult to help ourselves be aware of those triggers when they're happening, and to maybe get to a point eventually where we're able to detach. So you want to look for changes in your body. If you feel your heart rate getting fast, if you feel yourself starting to dissociate or pull back from your child, if you're rapid breathing, sweating, if at all possible, remove yourself from the situation. So that you don't react in a way that is unsafe emotionally or physically for your child. Things that can help on a longer term basis are deep breathing, journaling, mindfulness, reach out to social supports, call another parent. Thoughts are just thoughts. If you need to vent and talk to another parent, it's okay to do that, to process, so that you can come back and be present with your child. Those are all effective ways of coping with triggers. Now, to really fully move past them, emotional processing with a therapist is probably helpful, because you need to get into the hippocampus and rewire that back so it can move into a past tense memory rather than feeling so present and in the moment. Because you eventually want to be able to detach. Like maybe you feel it happening, you're like, oh, there it goes. Recenter yourself and use the coping strategies that you've learned to be able to do those things. Now, I wanted to share this. This is a poem that my 8-year-old wrote. She has really had a hard time during quarantine. And I just wanted to show this to show sort of what our kids might be going through. It's traumatic and it's hard on all of us, adults too. So it's going to be important for adults to get support from other adults so that we can be available to support our children through this, even when we're tired and when it's hard. And because I have always talked to her about her feelings and used RIE with her, used the Educaring Approach with her, she has an amazing emotional intelligence and is very clearly able to articulate what she's feeling. And we've been having lots of conversations about it, lots of processing. So hopefully that long term, this doesn't become something that's triggering for her. So last thing, grief is a part of processing trauma. It's important that we let ourselves and our children feel what we feel when we feel it. Now I say that. The only caveat is that if those feelings are expressed in a way that is overwhelming or damaging to your child, you know, if it's a feeling that's not appropriate to have around them, then you go and have it as soon as you can somewhere else. trauma almost always involves some kind of loss, whether it's a loss of a particular person, loss of the feeling of safety, loss of your freedom, loss of being able to play with your friends, whatever it is. But it's really important that we feel it fully if you want to integrate the experience into your brain in a healthy way. Because if you don't let yourself fully feel those feelings, that's when it gets problematic and you can get stuck in that stress response because the brain isn't able to file it away in the way that it needs to be. And that's it. We can open up for questions at this point.
Great. Do you want to, let's see. You can stop sharing if you want. If not, we can leave this on the screen. That's fine. Let's start. We have a couple great questions to start off. One of them is, so if you're having a low tolerance of trauma, when we were talking earlier in one of the slides, you talked about inappropriate reactions. And some of these include behavior other than meltdowns. Are there, basically, sorry, let me rephrase. What are the behaviors other than meltdowns that might still reveal trauma?
In a child or are they asking about children? Like how we might look for it? Okay. Meltdowns, hostility, withdraw from peers. You know, maybe you suggest, hey, let's have a Zoom meeting with your friend. And they're like, no, I'm not doing that. I don't want to talk. It's not worth the same. It's not worth it. In a toddler, we talk about those regressions. So maybe your fully potty learned child decides that they're gonna wet their pants all the time, or they want you to feed them. You may see, if they have a sibling, their interactions with their sibling may be different. They might be sensitive, extra sensitive to rejection. So something that you might normally say in a teasing way, all of a sudden feels like a huge rejection. It's not just a little joke like you used to, if your family has that sort of teasing relationship, which some families do. I'm talking about with children who are a little bit older, where you joke about things and then all of a sudden a joke is taken very personally when it wasn't in the past. That might be a sign of that as well.
Okay. Actually, can I ask you, let's go ahead and stop sharing your screen so that we can see you a little bigger.
Yeah. Hold on, there we go.
That way it'll be a little easier.
No, that just
up at the top. Should be.
Stop share, there it is. Okay.
Oh, excellent. Okay. So our next question is, how can we apply this to a child that's 18? So thinking about, so child versus a child on their way to adulthood.
Yep. So connection is going to be the big thing. If you already have that kind of connection with them, if you've been a parent who has been responsive throughout their childhood, if you have been available emotionally and they've talked about, they've been willing to talk about their feelings when they're younger, you have an easier starting point. That doesn't mean that you can't connect now. It just means that relationship has an underlying basis, because as teenagers, they are primed to separate from us, right? That's sort of developmentally what they're supposed to be doing. So one of the things you can do is, say you have an 18-year-old who's playing video games. Just go in and be like, hey, you mind if I watch you play video games for a while? And just hang out. You don't have to say anything. Just be available. Because then that gives them the opportunity to be in a safe space where they're maybe not looking at you, they're playing their video game, and maybe they feel comfortable to share. If you notice behaviors that aren't normal to who they are, have a conversation. It's like, hey, here's what I'm seeing. Would you like tell me about that? Because I'm worried about you. I'm noticing these behaviors and I love you and I want to make sure that you're feeling as well as you can. That's what I would recommend for that. And again, it's all about connection, because stress is more tolerable in a stable relationship. So if they're pushing you away, which they might, it's finding those moments when they are asking for connection and just being extra tuned in to when those might be. And again, it might just be sitting down next to them on the couch while they're watching a show that you absolutely hate, but you just sit and are emotionally open and available and give that sort of an air of receptivity, if that makes sense. Like, I'm just here, just hanging out, I'm with you, you know, we're side by side. So because there is that feeling of energy between two people, even if you're just sitting together in the same space.
Okay, great. Any recommendations for how to respond to your child after the parent overreacts?
Yes.
My son hits a lot. It is very physical, and it triggers the physical abuse I experienced as a child. When I am unable to leave and I get angry about it, any tips on how to repair after the parent's overreaction?
Yeah. Go back to your child and be honest in whatever developmental level is appropriate. So, you know, for a toddler, I think that's the only time I ever hit my kid was when she smacked me across the face, and it was an immediate reaction. Like, she hit me and I didn't even, there was no thought. And I immediately burst into tears because I felt so bad about hitting her. So I said, I'm going to calm down. And then I said to her, it was not okay for me to do that. I got angry because you hit me, and I just reacted. There was no thought, and I'm sorry. It's not okay for you to hit. It's not okay for me to hit, and I will try to do better next time. If you have an older child and you need to be, a good thing that if you can, catch the hitting before it happens. So if you know that there are certain triggers that make your child hit, be prepped just to prepare yourself to know that, okay, I'm going to tell him to turn off the TV and he's likely to start swinging. So you can just, again, be prepared going in that what's going to happen. So it's going to be a lot of work on your own self. So if you have blown up, you just go back and apologize. Oh, I yelled. I'm really sorry. It was not okay for me to scream at you like that. I lost my temper, and I'm going to try to do better next time. I really love you, and I don't want you to ever feel afraid of me. So it's just about repair. I mean, rupture and repair is part of relationship, and it's part of what builds attachment. And even from birth, there are going to be times when your child is crying and you get it wrong, but you keep trying, and they realize that. They're like, okay, they're trying to help me. They're trying to meet my need. They're here, they're present. And then you also model that for your child, that it's okay to make a mistake and come back and apologize. That's important, because then they don't feel like they have to be perfect either.
Great, thank you. With adopted children, here's a really good question. Especially those adopted from birth, there's a lot of discussion about trauma held in the body that manifests itself in various ways that can be can be hard to fully understand. How can we as adults help children navigate and understand this type of internal trauma?
Oof. I assume you're talking, if they're adopted from birth, sort of the theories now that we're talking about in utero stress, and children can be exposed to higher cortisol levels in the womb if mom, if mom is stressed because she doesn't really want to be pregnant, or whatever's happening in there. It is difficult to understand. So I would say that RIE is really wonderful for that. At a young age, to be slow and really responsive as you can be, because you're going to have to build that attachment in a different way. There's I don't want to be very careful how I phrase this. My sister's adopted, so let me start there. I don't want to imply in any way that there's less of a connection between an adopted mother and her infant than there is between a birth mother and her infant. There's just simply a hormonal thing that happens during birth in the brain that may not happen in quite the same way when it's not a biological child. So it's going to be important that once you have your child, you are telling them what you're going to do before you're doing it. You're very slow and methodical with them, and it's like if you look at all of the Pickler information has a lot to do with that. But as in terms of as your child gets older, if you're noticing things like that, there are therapists who specialize in somatic work, which is basically the idea that you have physical manifestations of trauma like that, whether it's anxiety or difficulty trusting people, or there's all kinds of ways it can manifest. But in terms of like physical feelings the child may be having, there are therapists who specifically work in ways to rewire those parts of the brain to get it out of the body.
Okay, lots of great questions here. Lots of
it's a heavy topic, I know.
Lots of big questions. My children hit and push each other. I do not know where they learned this behavior. I came from an abusive home where hitting and being hit by my siblings and being hit by my parents is normal. It triggers me in the moment, and how best to respond to these moments.
Depends how old your children are. Can she tell you that real quick? Is it okay? So I'm assuming
Yes. 2 and 4.
2 and 4. Okay. So at that moment, hitting is not allowed. I won't let you hurt each other. I understand you're angry, and you help them come up with different strategies. That doesn't mean they won't ever hit. My kids still hit each other. But what I want you to hear is that siblings hitting each other is very different from an abusive parent. And it's very different from children learning how to treat each other based on the way their parents treat them and treat each other. It's more at 2 and 4, it's more like impulse control issues. I'm mad, I can't, my prefrontal cortex is not fully developed to be able to stop that impulse to hit you. So giving replacement things to them to do is very helpful. I will never forget this moment. My daughter was was 23 months when my younger daughter was born. And I guess the baby was maybe 4 months old. And she was, my 2.5-year-old, really acting out. And I could tell she was just mad. And I said, do you want to, she wanted to go grab her sister. So I handed her a doll. And I said, do you want to show me with this doll what you'd like to do to Rose? And she basically like football checked it onto the ground and like just beat the heck out of it. Because she was mad, you know, she had big feelings. And feelings at those ages are really big. The limbic system, which handles emotion, is just lit up. If you look at a brain scan of a 2-year-old, it's just that emotional processing center is just on fire. And the part that controls impulse is not quite online yet. So part of our job as parents is to help make those connections. We want to help facilitate that wiring by giving them another opportunity to do it differently. I see you're mad. You really want to hit your sister. What can we do instead? You know, and she may or may not have ideas at 2. The 4-year-old's likely to have more ideas. Especially when they're trapped in the house with each other right now, it is way harder because they don't have any kind of break. It's just the 2 of them. So it's going to be harder right now. So I think what's going to be important for you is to remind yourself, this interaction is not my past. What is happening here is typical children behavior. I assume, I haven't seen their interactions, but from, if you're aware of it and you know that it's triggering you, I'm guessing it's probably pretty normal sibling interaction. I mean, my brother used to sit on my head and fart on me. I spit it in his mouth once. Like, just horrible things siblings do to each other. It's disgusting. But we are the best of friends now. Like, nobody's got my back like my brother. So some of that is just, you can be awful to your sibling. They're not going to go anywhere. Right? If you've built that relationship between them, they love each other so much that it's safe to be a jerk to them because they're still gonna love you and they're not gonna go anywhere. So I hope that helps. It's kind of a complicated issue, but I think it's really gonna be about checking yourself when you feel that trigger and just taking some deep breaths. If you need to stop the hitting in the moment, say, okay, I need you to stop. I'm going to have you go over here and you go over here. We're all just going to sit here for a minute. And then everybody can breathe together. You can bring it down. Maybe you need to hold the toy they're fighting over. And then you practice working it out with language because that's new for them. So they're going to need you to help them practice those conversations to start with. And eventually they'll start doing it on their own.
This is kind of a follow-up or sort of comes, I mean, you've talked about this a little bit, but do you have any other resources that you suggest on how to learn more about the rupture and the repair, i.e. how to repair those situations either between siblings, between parents and the children? So somebody just looking for more resources on how to repair peace.
For siblings, I love the book Siblings Without Rivalry. That's a really great book on how not to accidentally create a rivalry between your children. It's easy to do. You don't even think about it. If nobody tells you and you don't look into it, like you just don't, you say things without even thinking about it. And before you know it, it's a competition. For yourself, I'm trying to think what my best resources for that. I really like Dan Siegel's work. When you talk about the whole brain child, no drama discipline is a good one, things like that. He talks about how the child's brain works, and that will also give you some insight into how your brain may be working, especially if you personally had trauma at that particular age. I have found that folks tend to be triggered by their child's behavior at whatever the age was that their trauma happened. That's not always true, but say your trauma happened when you were 8, you may see your 8-year-old do something that then really brings it up for you. Or even just remembering being 8 can really activate that part of your brain and get you into a heightened, more aroused state.
Another question that also was how to help adults do this work. And if you feel comfortable, what did you do to support yourself through postpartum and any of your own trauma?
Yeah, postpartum medication for me, that was the answer. I had a history of depression. It just took a while to realize what was happening, and I had such guilt about taking medication because I was breastfeeding, and I thought, oh, I'm a horrible mother, and I should just be able to do this. And then I started medication and remembered that, oh yeah, the guilt and shame and all of that is part of depression. So I am a huge advocate of professional mental health support, whether that be starting with a therapist who is, now I'm not going to be able to come up with the name that I'm looking for. Ruth Ann would be able to tell me. There's a very specific, basically what you need to be able to do is to enter into a relationship with a therapist that can mimic that functional attachment. So I did a lot of this work when I was working with healthy families. So I would be mentoring a young mother who had never had a healthy relationship with her mom, or who had never been shown what a good mom looked like, for lack of a better word. So there it is, psychodynamic therapy. Thank you, Ruth Ann. It's late here. It's like 8 o'clock. I'm tired. Yeah, so psychodynamic therapy, if you can find someone who specializes in that, that's really good. But basically you need to be able to rewire that part of your brain in a healthy attachment with a therapist. So I would be working with a young mom and in sort of mothering her in a way, not in a paternalistic way, but being able to model for her how to respect a person and how to build a healthy attachment by my relationship with her. She could then translate to her relationship with her child.
Any advice on how to deal with pain trauma? So this sounds like physical pain.
Yeah.
I have a tendency to faint when I see blood or see a medical needle. I have a child who's now 3, and I have a hard time to deal with his large accidents. So recently he had a fall, split his lip, blood. I was able to help him and tried to remain calm, but I worry about passing on my phobias. The same with vaccinations. I struggle with him when I'm at the doctor's as the parent gets triggered.
Yeah. If you have another parent who can go with, that is awesome. I know many people don't. Like, you may either the other parent works and you are the one who does all the doctor's appointments, or or you're a single parent and it's just not an option. So I suppose it depends where your phobia stems from. Is there some sort of trauma that you experienced as a child? Were you hospitalized? Did you get exposed to a lot of needles? Is there something that's triggering that for you? Or is it just a phobia? Because that happens. People have just, you know, they have phobias of irrational phobias of things. It happens that way. If you were able to stay calm, that's the best you can do. Sometimes the best you can do is the best you can do. You know, if you can stay calm as possible and just keep narrating, because I have found that that will help keep you in your thinking brain rather than back in your emotional brain. So if you're talking about what's happening, oh, wow, it looks like you bumped your face here on the ground, and you can touch the ground where he hit the ground, so he can sort of make the connection of this is what happened. It's not this huge random scary thing. I tripped on my foot, I fell down and I bonked my face. Now it's bleeding. Let's go clean you up and see what's really going on here. Oh, it really hurt. I can tell it hurts, you know, and then so just talking through that and narrating is going to, as Magda says in one of her videos, it puts it through gray matter. So it's not pure impulse anymore.
Okay. If a child is regressing, how do we support them without fostering learned dependence? For example, a 4-year-old deciding she no longer knows how to take off her shoes and is unwilling to participate when gently invited to do part of a task.
Mm-hmm. Well, that child is expressing a need. So especially if we're talking about during this COVID time when everything is so stressful, I might just say, you really want me to take off your shoes for you? It's fun to pretend like we're little sometimes, isn't it? I'll help you. Yep, I can help you this time, and maybe you'll want to do it next time. So not to get caught up when there's high stress and making sure they do everything by themselves always. Like, yes, we want to foster independence, but we also want to recognize when our child needs more co-regulation from us. So you're not going to ruin your child by saying, you know, I know things are really stressful and hard right now. I can understand that. And it seems like you're needing a little more support from me. Do you want to sit on my lap while we put your shoes on? And see, because they're trying to tell you something. And maybe asking you to help with their shoes is the only way they can say, Mom, I need more right now. I'm scared, I'm lonely, I'm freaked out, and I don't really understand why. All the adults in my life are freaked out. You know, there's just sort of an energy in the air right now that's just kind of stressy and traumatic all around. You know, there's national things happening on a national level. And I think, you know, my parents shared that they've been having political discussions and the dog will end up like in my dad's lap because it escalates to such a high energy. So kids pick up those feelings too. And, you know, all feelings are okay, right? Feelings are just feelings. And it's how you act on those. So it's okay to be sad. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to be happy. You're allowed to feel whatever you feel, you know, on any given day. As adults, especially, one of the things I tell my kids with each other is you are allowed to feel whatever you feel. You are not allowed to abuse each other. So let's find a way to help process these emotions without hurting somebody else.
This goes very well into the next question of can you speak a little bit about vicarious trauma? For example, when children of color see recent incidents of police brutality and know that this could very well be their own experience. How do we help them navigate this? And does the vicarious trauma show up differently?
This is a very deep topic, and it's very emotional for me right now. I've been doing a lot of work around this myself, and it's something I've long thought about when we talk about not just the vicarious trauma of the incidents, but also the generational trauma and how that can be passed down in behaviors and in all kinds of ways. So the vicarious trauma I have mostly seen show up as anxiety. As much as possible, I would, depending on how old your child is, if you have a child under the age of, 11, I would say maybe 12, try to shield them from those images as much as possible. Have the conversations. Obviously, they're important conversations to have. I'm having them with my white children. But I don't know that they need to see the video. That's too much. It's too much to process. They can't can't do that yet. We need to buffer it in some ways. So if they've already seen it, you can talk about ways to find empowerment in that. You know, my daughter said to me the other day, you know, one of my biggest worries, Mom, I had gone to a protest, and she said, one of my biggest worries, Mom, is that the protesters will get hurt, and they might have kids that need them. And I'm worried they're going to get hurt. And I said, you know, I wish I could tell you that that wasn't a worry. God, I wish I could just say, you know what, you don't need to worry about that. It's okay. But I said, I understand that feeling. That is a real feeling. I don't understand why everybody doesn't feel it, but that is a real feeling. But what we can do, and Ruth Ann said this in her lesson, is here's what I've been doing to help. Would you like to find a way to help too? And she has now raised $1,100 for bail support in Indiana selling cookies. And that has really empowered her to feel like she has some way to contribute. And it's not just this huge amorphous thing out in the world that she has no control over and that there's no way to make it better. And to also talk about, I was reading this, Tim Wise was talking about in White Like Me, how to approach teaching racism and anti-racism to children. And that a good place to start is with the wins. Start with the civil rights movements, the things that went well. Start with the ways that white allies were able to participate and make change. Start there. So there is an empowerment and a positivity to it, and then move into here's what we're still experiencing, but change has been affected. We're not done yet, and it's a long road, and we'll keep walking it, and we'll keep marching forward and taking the steps we need to take to make this better. But movement is not impossible, you know, and to help that child find hope, you know, look for the helpers, as Mr. Rogers said, you know, look for those wins.
Following up on that one, this goes back to the COVID, to quarantine. This is a little bit long, but I want to make sure to read it direct. I have 4-year-old twin girls, and they've been raised RIE to the best I can. They are very attached to each other. During quarantine, I noticed that their pretend play has reached another level altogether. I understand where it's coming from, but a lot of times they are so into it and just talking to each other that they are absolutely unable to process anything that I'm trying to say to them or get them to do. It's just getting impossible to get them to stop being with each other and listen outside. It really triggers me because I've had emotionally unavailable parents and never felt heard or cared for. So we do speak about it when everyone is calm, but a lot of what the parent says is, and I get statements like, I miss my friend, or when will this virus go away? Things like that. And so the question is, what would you say to help me and her twin 4-year-olds in this time?
Yeah. I think it's great that you understand where the behavior is coming from and how they are using each other and their imaginary world as a form of escapism and as a way to process. Children's imaginary play is a wonderful way for them to process grief and trauma. I had a little boy whose grandmother had a heart attack, and he played ambulance for months, processing it, figuring it out, what happened, you know, going to the hospital. Pretend play is a wonderful way for them to process. Now, I had a daughter who I could be this close to her saying, Emmeline, 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 and nothing. I had to touch her. So in the moment, it's difficult, but if you can engage them, if they're willing to do this, now you don't want to force them. If you can engage them in a way to say, hey, it's really hard for me, like when it's time for dinner or it's time for a bath and there's something that needs to be done to get your attention. And I'm really struggling with that. And I feel it's hard for mommy when I don't feel like anybody's listening to me. And I'm wondering, do you have any ideas about how I can access you? You know, what would help? Is there a way I can touch you? Is there a certain code word that we could use? Is there a bell? Whatever it is. And if you can engage them in that, I have found that very helpful. My daughter can't respond until she's finished a page she's reading. It's kind of an OCD thing, like she has to get to the end of the page. So we have a signal. I say her name and she's allowed to hold up her finger to let me know she's heard me. So I don't keep repeating. And then she gets to a stopping place and then looks up and says, yeah, mom, what? Where before we had that, I just felt dismissed and like, why are you ignoring me? And then she explained, no, I can't, I have to read, to the end of my page. And God bless her teachers, they learned this too. They would tell everybody to clean up and they knew Emmeline's not moving until she finishes her page and then she'll close it and she'll join the group. So I think strategies like that are going to be important, ways that you can feel like you can get through to them when necessary without it being a coercion or forced. And then so try to empower them as much as you can. They're 4, so they may or may not be able to articulate something that will work. And then you can say, well, can we try this? Maybe it's a pretty xylophone or a musical instrument or something that, and also try to, that routine is going to help because anticipation breeds cooperation, right? So if they know what's coming and the day looks the same most days, it'll be easier for them to tolerate, this is what's coming next. And you can say, hey, get eye contact, whatever that is, get in, hey, I'm here. Can you see me? Okay, I'm going to let you go back to playing, but we have 10 minutes to lunch. So, they may not know what 10 minutes is at this point, but they know lunch is coming soon, or I'm going to the kitchen. When I'm finished making lunch, I'm going to come back and get you and it'll be time to eat. Do you want to have if you can tune into their pretend play, that'll help too. Hey, princesses, why don't we come do this? Or whatever they're playing, if you can engage in that with them, that's a great way to gain cooperation.
Back on sort of the rupture and repair side, how do you prevent the child from feeling guilty when the parent apologizes so that the child doesn't take on, it was my fault, the parent reacted this way?
Yep. So I always try to, when I would apologize for something, I would say, this is not your fault. You are a child and I am the grown-up. You are still learning how to manage those feelings. I need to, I've learned how my brain is in a different place than yours is. I don't want you to feel guilty. You're doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing right now. Do I get mad sometimes? Yeah, because I'm a person too. And we have a relationship together. So it's going to happen sometimes. Sometimes I'm going to get mad, just like you got mad at me yesterday when I asked you to do something and then you yelled and threw a fit. Like, we get to be mad at each other. Doesn't mean we don't love each other. We're just people who have emotion, a full range of emotions. And I'm going to try to be appropriate and respectful in my emotions so that you can learn how to do so with yours by, watching our interactions.
So I have 2 questions here on, let me give this to you in 2 parts, 2 different questions. The first part is, I was sexually abused for many years when I was younger. This person is now 38 years old and dealing with a lot of issues from this. For example, I get really nervous and experience a level of fear when I am in a space alone with a man, even if I know them well. The fight or flight kicks in every time. Any advice to help me get through situations like this? And then let me give you part 2 of that is somebody who was sexually abused as a younger person, but also wants to maybe help others. So the first part is help me in this current situation, but then also what should I study or any books or something to read? What should I look at to maybe help others as well?
So that psychodynamic therapy is going to be real important in that, because you're going to have to rewire that part of your brain. Other than sort of CBT and replacement thinking, when you're in those moments with a man you know well, say, nothing bad is happening now. I know this person, we have a relationship, and just sort of talk yourself through what might be going on and to give yourself sort of replacement thoughts to what is actually happening in the moment versus what the past tense memory is. But to get it to a point where it just doesn't happen as much anymore, that's going to require working with a really good therapist, in my opinion. I'm not a therapist, so it's a little hard for me to touch on it. I know what I've studied, but from what I have read, it's about rewiring that part of your brain and making a new neural connection so that when you're in a space with a man, that doesn't happen. And in terms of helping somebody else, it's really important to do your own work first, because it can be really easy to get into an unhealthy pattern because you can get dysregulated hearing about other people's stories. It could be very triggering to your own trauma. So I feel like it's very important to do your own work first, that you can get to a point where you can detach in a healthy way from your trauma and use it to help others, almost like you would in a 12-step program. Yeah, like being a sponsor, right? So that's one of the things that happens in a 12-step program. You do your own work, and then you're ready to tell somebody else what it was like, what it happened, and what it's like now.
What is CBT that you referenced?
Oh, cognitive behavioral therapy is what that stands for. So, for example, my daughter is struggling with body image right now. So her brain, she said to me, my heart knows what's true, but I can't get my brain to be quiet. So when she thinks I'm fat and ugly, she says, that's not true. You are beautiful, you are strong, you are perfect. You know, so she replaces that thinking. There's a lot of replacement thinking versus like, okay, so what do I know to be true? And you can go through that sort of process. But if you look up cognitive behavioral therapy, you'll get a much more detailed description of what that is.
This is a great question to end with. I know we're a little over time, but I'm going to take one more here because we've just got such great questions and so much here. I know that this webinar is specifically for people with kids, but a lot of what you've been saying has resonated with me because it reminds me of the behavior I exhibit with friends, significant others, and sometimes even the children I babysit, though far less often. So with them, even now, before I have children, because of childhood trauma, I'm living with my father again because of quarantine. I've been working on learning about and addressing the trauma of my childhood for years now, but I'm more aware than ever of how my dad's stress levels and negativity impact me. What advice do you have for the people who are situated right now with the parents who they experience trauma with and who will not or never have gotten any help for their own trauma?
Okay, so the question is, what advice do I have for an adult dealing with the parents who traumatize them to regulate themselves and deal with that? Okay.
During this quarantine where obviously they're living with these again as an adult.
Writing, journaling is very helpful. Whatever feelings you're having, just get them out on paper. That is a really wonderful thing because a lot of times as you're writing, things sort of process in a different way. There's some sort of mind-body connection thing that happens when you're writing that doesn't necessarily always happen when you're talking. I don't really understand it because I haven't studied that, but I've seen it in action many, many times and experienced it myself. So if you go have an experience, if your dad does something that triggers you, go back in your bedroom and just write about it. Just put everything you want to say to him on paper. That would be my best advice there. And then as soon as you can, get some support and get some help because you deserve it, you know. And the other thing is to have some empathy for him as much as you can and to realize that most parents are doing the best they can with what they have. That doesn't mean it was enough, but it might help you to sort of find whatever forgiveness and empathy for him you can. Not for him, but for you. Because it will be very healing for you to be able to see, you know what, that's all he's capable of. I wish he was capable of more, but he's just not. So let me focus on what things are good about that relationship. I'm going to focus on those. I'm going to let go of the rest. And that requires work. It does. It requires a supportive therapeutic environment with which to get to that point.
Okay. All right. We have a few more. I am not sure. I'm feeling as if we should stop. We're about 10 minutes after 5. We've hit most of the top level ones. I will just say, just to add that there were a couple other questions about specific cases. I would just put it, if you could just end with kind of a closing, if you are experiencing these things, maybe perhaps seeking help.
Absolutely. If you personally are experiencing trauma and have unresolved trauma, I highly recommend getting a therapist. Of course, if you are having any thoughts of harming yourself in any way, there are suicide hotlines to access. There's all kinds of telemedicine therapists right now. I'm not the hugest fan of that because I feel like being in proximity with each other is important, but for now, it's a place to start to build a relationship. If you think that your child is really struggling, again, I would access help for them as well. Now, some symptoms can, last for a couple weeks and, to a month or so. But if it's, more than 8 weeks that they've been having, symptoms of this, it's definitely worth looking into getting them some support.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Mary. This has been fantastic. We got a lot of also positive feedback in the chat. People are saying thank you very much and that they enjoyed the presentation. Thank you. This was recorded and this live on YouTube within 24 hours. And we'll also post that to all of our social media channels as well.
Thanks, everybody. Take care of yourselves.